Every morning she would slowly open the curtains, let the sunlight into his room, and carefully set out the tray. Black coffee, scrambled eggs, warm toast, and a flower from the garden. It was their silent ritual. He never asked for it, but she did it with all her heart. And him? He smiled with his eyes, left shy notes in the cup, and sometimes held her hand longer than necessary. It was all a whisper of unspoken promises. But on Saturday afternoon, when she arrived with the coffee, the house was full. The flowers were in the vases at the entrance. The music was playing loudly. Laughter came from the living room. And he was at the altar, in a suit, with another woman. She stood at the door, the tray still in her hands. No one noticed her presence. The women from the buffet hurried past, the photographer dodged the door without apologizing, and the sound of her yes cut like a knife into his soul. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, she didn't break anything. She simply left the tray on the table in the corner, as she did every morning, and left without making a sound. The coffee went cold, the flower wilted, and that day a silent promise died. But destiny doesn't forget those who serve with love, and much less those who pretend not to see. If this story has already caught your attention in the first few seconds, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It makes all the difference in helping more people find stories like this. The morning always began the same. The sky was still pale, the silence of the house intact, and she walked with light steps through the wide corridors of the mansion. Her hands were holding the tray, her gaze was steady, and she placed everything in its place with an almost ritualistic delicacy. The coffee was freshly brewed just the way he liked it, strong without sugar. The toast was golden, the eggs cooked to perfection, and always a flower from the garden, picked with care, rested next to the cup. White roses on sunny days, lavender when the sky was cloudy. He said he liked the scent of lavender on winter mornings, and she never forgot that. It was a house with white columns and huge windows, where time seemed to pass more slowly. The kind of place where the furniture was dust-free and smiles were restrained. But in that suite on the top floor, there was a silent routine that only the two of them knew. He would wake up as soon as she touched the doorknob. He pretended to be sleepy, but he was already waiting for that moment. Without saying a word, she would open the curtains, let the sun touch his face, and arrange the tray on the bedside table. Sometimes his eyes would linger on hers. Sometimes he would smile with just one corner of his mouth, and she would return the gesture with her soul full of something she dared not name. There were no confessions, there were no promises, just that space between serving and being noticed, where hope lived without making a noise. To others, she was just the maid. To him, perhaps a cozy habit, but to her that daily gesture carried everything she couldn't say, and she said it in silence, with the care of the folded napkin, with the care not to let the spoon clink, with the flower she chose with her eyes closed, asking her heart to guess his mood that day. It was a game without words, but full of symbols. One day she found a folded note under the cup. "You make my mornings bearable," unsigned. But she knew. She kept the paper, as if she were keeping a sacred secret. That was their world, made of absences, glances, and small signs. And even without a single intimate touch, she felt that she belonged to that house like someone who belongs to a place she doesn't want to leave. She had never asked for love, only presence. And he was always there between one sip and the next, with his eyes saying everything that his lips would never say. But fate is not moved by kind gestures. And that Saturday, when the smell of coffee still wafted through the hallway, the sound of strange footsteps echoing down the stairs would announce that their world was about to disappear. Her name was Marlene. She was born in a small town in the interior of Texas, where winters were dry and words were few. Her childhood was made up of harsh silences, of a mother who worked twice as hard, and a father who went out to buy cigarettes and never came back. Life taught her early on that no one came to save anyone, that bread was earned with the tips of injured fingers, and that feelings, when too exposed, became weakness. She grew up learning not to wait, but she still waited. She waited for looks, she waited for hugs, She waited for someone to one day see more than her calloused hands. At 20, she moved to the big city. She carried a small suitcase and a heart that, even though unaccustomed to it, still beat with a certain hope. She found a job as a cleaner in a cheap hotel, then worked in family homes until she was assigned to work in that mansion. They said it was a difficult house, full of demands and invisible rules, but she was not intimidated. He knew how to do what was needed, and he did it perfectly. Every corner was cleaned, every piece of clothing ironed with almost surgical precision. But it was in the kitchen that they discovered Marlene's silent talent. She made coffee like no one else. It was an inexplicable gift, as if the aroma were part of her soul. Little by little, he began to gain space. First, he cleaned the library. Then he began to organize the master bedroom. And then, over time, he began to bring breakfast to his boss, the youngest son of the Donovan family. He had inherited his parents' house after his father's death, and he lived there alone, enveloped in silences and business commitments that made him absent even from himself. But on the mornings when Marlene served coffee, something softened in him. His eyes lingered longer on the horizon. His breathing seemed less heavy. She never crossed the line of what was allowed. She never sat down, never talked for longer than necessary, but there was a sweetness in her demeanor that could not be ignored. Even on days when the world seemed to be falling apart outside, she would show up with the same tray, the same delicacy, as if to say, "No matter what happens, I'm still here." That was the place she occupied. Invisible to others, essential to him. And deep down, she knew it wasn't love in the romantic sense, nor soap opera. Passion. It was something more subtle. The feeling of being seen, even if only briefly. The illusion that, in the absence of words, gestures could be promises, and she lived off that, on crumbs of affection, on remnants of presence. What no one knew was that every night, before going to sleep, she would go back to her room at the back of the house, take the note folded under her pillow, and read it again in silence. It was just a sentence, no name, no signature, but it fed everything she had. Stopped dreaming about. It was as if he had touched a part of her that no one else knew, and even without asking for anything, she gave everything, her fidelity, her care, her waiting. Because, deep down, I still believed that some loves are born like this, without shouting, without happening, but existing with the strength of an entire life. His name was Nathan Donovan. He was the youngest son of a family that graced the covers of business magazines and society columns. He grew up surrounded by crystal glasses, private schools, and international travel. But he never liked exposure. From an early age, he preferred the corners, the backstage, the world where no one demanded anything but silence. While his older brother prepared to take over the family business, Nathan took refuge in books and routines that the world found too banal. When his father died, he was the one who inherited the house, not by choice, but because his brother refused. And since then, that mansion has become more of a hiding place than a home. Nathan was a man of strict habits. He woke up early, ran the garden paths, answered emails with surgical precision, and spent hours alone in his office. He was never seen with many women. There were rumors, of course, as there are about every young, wealthy man, but no one could say for sure who truly held his heart. And the truth was, up until that point in his life, he hadn't allowed anyone to. Until Marlene. He himself didn't know when it started. She was just an employee. Discreet, silent, almost invisible. But there was something about the way she took care of things that disconcerted him. The way she arranged the napkin on the tray. The care she took not to spill the coffee. The light scent of lavender she left in the air. It was as if she transformed the ordinary into something almost sacred. And for someone like Nathan, used to being served out of obligation, that was new. It was strange. And, without understanding how, he began to wait for her. He started leaving notes under her cup. Little things. Perfect coffee. Thanks for the flower. Today is less grey. Nothing compromising, but filled with something he himself couldn't name. And every time she found them, her heart would tighten in a silence that no one could hear. He watched from afar, from the mirror, from the crack in the door. from the balcony where he pretended to read the newspaper. She never smiled too much. She never said anything in response. But there was a silent pact between them, as if they both knew there was more to it than it seemed, but neither dared cross the line. Sometimes at night, he would come down to the kitchen. He would say he was sleepless, or hungry, or needed tea. But she was the one he wanted to see. He would sit at the counter watching her in silence, and she would prepare the drink as if she were composing a song. The steam would rise, their eyes would meet, but the words would remain locked in the corners of her mouth. At certain moments, he would almost touch her hand as he picked up the cup. Almost, but he never did, because Nathan was made of breaks, and she of waiting. The older employees began to notice the long pauses, the glances, but no one said anything, because in that house everything was kept as if time froze feelings between one meal and the next, and yet each gesture between them was like a comma in a text that was never completed. Until one night when it was raining heavily and the power went out for a few hours, he said in a whisper, almost like an outburst. "Sometimes I wish I could disappear with you just for a few days." She froze. Her heart skipped a beat, but she didn't answer. She just served the tea and left before he could see the tears that fell down the dark hallway. After that stormy night, something changed. The house looked the same. Windows open in the morning, the garden clean, voices muffled between rooms. But there was an uneasiness in the air, as if everything had been slightly displaced. Marlene began to walk with even quieter steps, her eyes lowered, as if his words had opened a place inside her that she dared not enter. And Nathan began to avoid the second glance. She still accepted the coffee, still smiled with her eyes, but she no longer left notes. It was as if I was afraid of what might happen if the line really broke. Even so, the complicity persisted. She understood him with a gesture. He sought her with his gaze. On the days when he returned from tense meetings, it was Marlene's coffee that calmed him down. On Sundays, when the house was completely silent, she would make simple pies and leave a slice covered with a linen cloth on the kitchen counter. And he, without saying anything, would leave the dishes washed and a flower next to the empty plate. They communicated in a language that no one else spoke, a language of details, of absences filled with presence, of love that was not confessed because he did not know if it was allowed to exist. Little by little, he began to notice details he had never noticed before, the way she tied her hair with a pencil when she was busy, the faint marks of fatigue on her fingers, the small scar near her left wrist. She, in turn, memorized his schedules, his silences, his tastes. She knew when he needed tea instead of coffee. She knew when he wanted to read and when he just wanted silent company. She knew when his eyes were saying, "Stay a little longer." It wasn't a youthful passion. It wasn't a forbidden desire in the usual sense. It was something deeper, rarer, like two solitudes that recognized each other, two worlds that found shelter in each other, even if secretly, and that was enough. Or at least, it seemed to be enough. But the world around him didn't stop. Nathan's commitments became more demanding. New visitors began to appear at the house, businessmen, old friends, well-dressed women who didn't know how to say thank you when they received a cup of coffee. Marlene served them with the same care as always, but every loud laugh that echoed in the room hurt more deeply than she let on. And he, even when he was surrounded by people, sought her gaze from afar, as if begging for a sign, as if to say, "Just wait for me a little longer," until one warm Thursday afternoon she overheard, by accident, the conversation in the office. He was on the phone, speaking softly and tensely. "Yes, I understand. That's what they expect of me. I'm already in agreement with everything. She has the perfect profile. Her family fits in well. It will be a discreet, elegant wedding. Let's set the date." She stopped. The dishcloth slipped from her hand. Her heart skipped a beat in a way it hadn't since she was a girl. But she didn't go in. She didn't question. She didn't confront. She went back to the kitchen. She made the tea as usual. She served it without looking anyone in the eye. And that day, for the first time, she didn't leave the flower on the tray. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat on the edge of her bed, her apron still on her lap, her eyes fixed on the white wall of the narrow room at the back of the house. It was a simple room, with no large windows, no rugs, no pictures. But it was where she had cultivated the small fragments of hope all those months. The note he had left was there, folded as always, but this time she didn't pick it up. She was afraid that if she read it again, it would lose its meaning, that the words that had sustained her until then would prove empty, like a promise spoken out of politeness. And deep down she already knew he hadn't been cruel, just cowardly. The next morning she got up early. She made the coffee with the same care, prepared the tray with the same precision as always. But now her movements were mechanical, as if they were part of a ritual that she was no longer a part of. She went upstairs, as she did every day, opened the door slowly, and saw him there, sitting on the bed, already awake. His eyes searched for her, as always, but she just walked to the bedside table, put the tray down, arranged the cutlery, and left, without saying anything, without lingering. He stood there surprised, expecting perhaps a smile, a word, a flower. But there was no flower anymore, and he realized, perhaps for the first time, that something had changed. In the days that followed, she kept everything the same. She never missed work. He never broke protocol. But the sparkle in her eyes had disappeared. Her steps were no longer light, they were firm and discreet. She began to avoid moments when they would be alone. She would disappear from the kitchen when he showed up. She no longer accepted lingering glances. It was as if she were dismantling, piece by piece, the story that never happened, because now she knew he was going to get married. And even though he said it was an obligation, that it was expected, that it was the family name, he still chose. And that choice hurt more than any words. She started going out later, so as not to cross paths with him, and when she did, she kept her face neutral, as if nothing had ever happened. But inside, something screamed. She felt foolish, used without having been touched, the kind of pain that no one sees because it seems small, but that only those who experience it know how corrosive it is. Because what she had from him was not a kiss. It was not a body. It was something worse. It was almost love. It was the illusion that he also saw what she felt, that the silences shared were worth more than empty promises. On the last Sunday before the wedding, he walked into the kitchen and found her preparing lunch. He stood there, looking at her as if trying to retrieve something lost. "Marlene," he said. That was it. But she didn't stop. She kept chopping tomatoes, as if her name had never been said that way before. He tried again, moved closer. "Are you okay?" She looked up for a second, nodded slightly, and went back to work. There was no hurt on her face, just absence, as if he wasn't there anymore. And in that moment, he understood what he had lost, and that it might be too late to fix it. The wedding preparations took over the house like a wave that invades without asking permission. Decorators, florists, waiters, people who spoke loudly and gestured as if everything there was just a set, and in a way, it was. A rehearsed ceremony, a strategic union, a spectacle carefully put together to please a lineage. Marlene watched everything happen from afar, as if watching a parade in slow motion. With each white ribbon hung, each flower arranged in perfect arrangements, she felt her presence in that house shrink, as if the space itself was already pushing her out. Even so, she didn't ask for leave. She didn't miss a single day. She continued waking up early, cleaning the rooms, preparing meals with the same perfection as before. But now, when she met Nathan's eyes, there was no more tenderness, no more hurt. There was only distance, and that hurt him more than she could imagine, because while she collected the remains of her own illusion with dignity, he lost himself in the guilt he couldn't admit. He tried to find her in the hallways, tried to force conversations, but she didn't open any door. She served, organized, left, without another glance. The other employees were talking and whispering about the wedding, about his future wife, a young woman from high society, the daughter of an influential politician, beautiful, elegant, bland. Marlene listened without hearing. She knew he had chosen her out of convenience, and perhaps that hurt even more, knowing that she had not been passed over for true love, but for a pact of appearances. She, who had given him the best of herself in simple and faithful gestures, was not worth a pretty photo in a Sunday paper. She was too invisible to fit the role of a Donovan's wife. And that she would never forget. The day before the wedding, the house was a whirlwind. Rehearsals, adjustments, final confirmations. The bride arrived with her entourage of programmed smiles and eyes that didn't linger on anyone other than their own reflection. Nathan followed her stiffly, taking each step like a polite prisoner. Marlene passed them in the hallway, she in a light linen dress, he in a navy blue blazer. When his eyes met hers, the world seemed to stop for a second, but she just gave a slight nod, as if wishing him good luck. And they continued on, without stopping, without turning around. That night, alone in the back room, she took the note out of the drawer for the last time. She read it slowly. "You make my mornings bearable." She smiled bitterly. She crumpled the paper, not out of anger, but because she finally did. That sentence no longer sustained her. It was no longer a shelter. It was a reminder of a lie that had never been told. She turned out the light early. She didn't cry. She just took a deep breath, because she knew that the sun would rise the next day, and she would bring him coffee as always, even though she knew it would be the last time. Saturday arrived with a sky that was too clear for what she felt inside. At 7 in the morning, Marlene was already in the kitchen, her hands shaking but her movements precise. She prepared the coffee as usual, the same ground coffee he said he preferred, the water at just the right temperature, the tray arranged as if the world was still the same as yesterday. But it wasn't. That morning the whole house was celebrating. The smell of flowers filled the rooms. The musicians were doing sound checks in the garden, and the guests began to arrive in shiny cars that took the entrance. Marlene knew everything, but she forced herself to pretend that it was still an ordinary day. She walked up the stairs as if marching into a battlefield. With each step, the tray felt heavier. The flower she had chosen for today, a white rose, his favorite, was trembling slightly on the edge of the plate. She reached the bedroom door, knocked lightly twice, and entered. He was standing there, already partially dressed, his suspenders hanging from his shoulders, his shoes still untied. His eyes looked up at her, and for a moment there was silence. She walked to the small table, set the tray down with the same care as always, arranged the cutlery, and, as if by default, held out her hand to hand him the flower. He took it hesitantly, his fingers brushing. Hers for a second too long, but she didn't hold it. She stepped back. She said simply, "Congratulations on your great day, Mr. Donovan," and left. Downstairs, the house was buzzing. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, the expensive perfumes, everything clashed with the stillness she tried to maintain inside. While the other staff bustled about serving the guests, Marlene took refuge in the small service hallway, where she could see, through the crack in the door, the ceremony set up in the far garden. The white chairs lined up, the altar covered in flowers, the bride with her veil resting on her shoulders. The music began. Everyone stood up. He walked in. His suit was impeccable, the posture of a determined man. But his eyes weren't there. She watched it all as if she were watching her own heart being buried in slow motion. There was no scene. There was no drama. Just the realization that he had chosen another path, another name, another destiny. And yet, inside her, there, was still respect, not for him, but for everything she had felt alone. Because love, when true, does not require presence to continue being love. Sometimes it is enough to accept that it existed and let it go with dignity. The "I do" was said at 3:20 in the afternoon. The bride smiled at the guests. Her veil danced with the light wind, and the music filled every space in the garden. There was applause, staged kisses, cameras capturing perfect angles. From inside, behind a half-open curtain, Marlene watched the scene in absolute silence. She didn't cry. She just felt her body throb as if something inside her was slowly dying, and no one noticed. The whole world celebrated a union built on convenience, while she said her own goodbye with the strength of someone who knows she will not be remembered. As soon as the photographer shouted for everyone to get in position for the official photo, Marlene left. She walked down the side hallway, through the kitchen, and into the small back room. She picked up the bag she had packed days before, a few clothes, the crumpled note, and a change of dignity intact. She didn't ask for an account. She didn't wait for the end of her shift. She simply left her apron folded on the counter, next to an envelope with a brief letter. Inside, a few lines written in a firm hand. "Thank you for everything. I only take with me what no one sees." At the service door, she stopped for a second. She heard the music in the distance, the cheering, voices, the fake laughter. And then she took a deep breath, clutched the bag to her chest, and left. No one saw her leave. No one noticed her absence. It was as if finally she had fulfilled her invisible role until the end. The street was empty, the sky too blue, and her steps continued calmly, as if each meter she walked erased a little of the pain she carried. Meanwhile, Nathan was receiving the greetings. He smiled, hugged, feigned joy with the same precision with which he lived. But there was something in his eyes, a missing line, a silent hesitation. When he came back into the house hours later, exhausted from his own act, he went to the kitchen to get a glass of water. And there, on the counter, he saw the folded apron and the envelope. His heart raced. He opened it carefully, read the words, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. He ran upstairs. He searched the back hallway. He called her name softly, as if there was still a chance. But the room was empty. The bed was made. Nothing of her remained. Not her perfume, not the sound of her footsteps. And in that moment, in the silence, he understood what he had done. He had traded presence for appearance. He had chosen a safe fate over real love. And now, it was too late. He sat on the edge of the bed. His jacket still smelled of wedding flowers. He looked at the farewell note as if looking into a broken mirror. And there, in the room where so many mornings had begun with hope, all that remained was the bitter taste of coffee that would never be served again. Time passed with cruel slowness. The house, once alive with Marlene's small gestures, now seemed too big. The hallways echoed with hollow footsteps, and even the fresh flowers that the new staff placed in each room seemed artificial. Nathan was busy with trips, events, interviews, always with his wife by his side, always with a ready smile. But at night, when silence descended on the mansion, it all came back. The smell of coffee, the flour on the tray, the sound of cutlery being carefully placed. And the absence of all this was louder than any memory. He tried to convince himself that he had made the right choice, that the woman he married was ideal for his position. Beautiful, educated, politically strategic, but cold. So cold that her eyes never met his. They slept in separate beds after the first month. They ate dinner with their cell phones between the cutlery, and they talked only about commitments and appearances. His life became an impeccable and empty scene, like a frame without a photograph. Sometimes he would go down to the kitchen alone. He would sit on the same marble bench where he used to watch her make tea, and he would just sit there doing nothing, just watching. One of those nights he picked up a cup and wrote on the back with a pen, "You still visit me in silence." Then he put the cup away on the bottom shelf, as if she might come back one day and find it. He began to walk through the mornings with the feeling that someone was watching him even when he was alone. Her body was no longer there, but her presence persisted. One day, while going through his old papers, he found the note he had written to her at the beginning, the one he had left under her cup. "You make my mornings bearable." He read it, reread it, and something he couldn't name took hold of him inside. It was longing, it was guilt, it was love in a state of regret. And for the first time since their marriage, he cried, not from pain but from emptiness. Little by little he began to look for her, discreetly. He discovered that she had resigned without a reference. No one knew where she had gone. Some said she had returned to the countryside. Others said she had found work in a modest cafe, but no address was certain, and the more he searched, the more he realized that perhaps she did not want to be found. It was at this point that he began to lose himself, because loving in silence is bearable, but realizing that he was loved and didn't know how to care, that corrodes. The house became a mausoleum of what was never said, and even with all the furniture in place, the clothes lined up in the closet, and the wedding photos on the shelves, everything in Nathan seemed suspended, as if without Marlene he had stopped waking up altogether. And then she began to wait, as she had once waited. But now there was no one coming with a tray in their hands. There were no flowers, no tea, no touch, only the memory of what had not been lived, and the certainty that the truest love he had ever had was the one that left in silence. Nathan spent the next few months trying to move on, but everything around him seemed like a misplaced memory. At lunches with his wife, there was constant silence. At social events, he smiled out of obligation, and in the mornings, even with professionally prepared trays, he felt no pleasure in anything. It was as if the days had lost their depth. There were no more notes, no eyes that looked at him with truth, only reflections, repetitions, appearances. The life he had chosen for himself was beautiful in the photos, but arid inside. One winter afternoon, as he was driving aimlessly through the city streets, he stopped at a traffic light near an old neighborhood he rarely visited. As he glanced out the window, his eyes were drawn to a small corner cafe with a pale blue awning and a discreet storefront. There was something about the place, not in its appearance but in the way it felt. He parked his car without knowing why. He went inside. The bell above the door rang, and the familiar aroma of fresh coffee immediately enveloped him. The atmosphere was simple but welcoming. A few tables, a bookshelf with old books, plants in the corners, and behind the counter, with her back to him, a woman was preparing a tray. Her gestures were precise, light, deeply familiar. His heart raced even before she turned around. And then she turned around. Marlene. Her hair tied up in a practical way, her apron light, her eyes attentive to what she was doing. She didn't see him right away. She was busy serving a customer. When she finally looked at him, her eyes hesitated for a second. No open surprise, no impulsive gesture, just a silent recognition, like someone seeing an old echo materialize before them. Nathan wanted to speak, but he couldn't. He just walked to the counter, sat on the wooden bench, and waited. She approached. She took a cup. She poured the coffee with the same delicacy as always, and then she placed next to it a flower. They didn't say a word. She just went back to her work, and he stood there, his hands around the cup, trying to contain what his heart was screaming. It was her. Still her, but different, stronger, more in control of herself, more distant, and he understood that perhaps there was no place for him there anymore, that she had loved him at a time when little was enough, and that now perhaps she had learned to love herself first. He came back a few more times, always at the same time. He sat in the same place. She served him with the same care, but never started a conversation. She was professional, cordial, kind. And that was what hurt him the most, realizing that the place he had once held, even if in silence, no longer existed. She had forgiven him, perhaps, but she had not come back. And then he began to understand what it was like to lose someone you never really had. He began to understand the value of the silences she offered, of the gestures that never demanded retribution, and deep down, he began to see himself as small in the face of her greatness. Nathan began to make the little cafe his daily refuge. He would arrive at 9:15, sit in the same chair near the window, and watch Marlene go about her routine with the calm of someone who had silently rebuilt her life. It was like watching a movie in which he no longer had a role. She smiled at the customers, arranged fresh flowers in vases, read books during breaks. There was a peace about her that disarmed him, a clarity that hurt. She was no longer the woman she had been before. She was someone whole, and he was just someone trying to put together the pieces of something he had never had the courage to own. The days repeated themselves like an inverted ritual. Now he was the one waiting. He was the one watching in silence, hoping for a longer gesture, a word beyond. "Good morning." But Marlene maintained the same posture. She took care of the place with tenderness, without rushing anything, and served each cup as if it were the only one. When it was his turn, she would hand him the coffee with kindness, place a small flower in it, sometimes a daisy, other times a violet, and return to the counter. Her eyes never left his, but they didn't linger either. There was respect. It was over. But there was no more room for promises. One autumn morning, he gathered his courage and left a note under her cup. "I miss you. I still dream of the mornings when you would come in without saying a word and change everything." He waited, but she didn't answer. The next day she served him coffee as usual, but without the flowers. He understood. It wasn't anger, it was a limit. It was her way of saying, "Don't go back to where you didn't want to be." And yet he came back, every day. Not because he insisted, but out of gratitude, because sitting in that cafe was his way of asking for forgiveness without words, of acknowledging that he had failed, that he had exchanged something rare for something empty, that he had been afraid and hidden behind obligations, and that now, even though he had no right whatsoever, he just wanted to see her well. Nathan's friends found his change strange. He avoided events and refused invitations. His wife no longer questioned him. The marriage was no more than a silent contract. He went to the cafe as if he were doing penance. He didn't demand anything. He just waited, not for her, but for himself, to see if there was still healing in the simple act of accepting the loss. One day, as he was leaving, he saw a couple sitting in the back. She was smiling. She was talking to the man with the light beard and kind eyes. It wasn't an exaggerated laugh, it was sincere, lively. And Nathan felt something sink inside. But he also smiled, because in that moment he understood that she had rediscovered what he had failed to protect, the right to be happy. That day he didn't go straight home. He walked through the city as if he were searching for air, and at every corner he remembered his own choices. There was no resentment, just a calm regret, the certainty that, somewhere in time, he had everything, and didn't know how to see it. The following days seemed shorter. Nathan continued to go to the cafe, but now he no longer expected a return, not a sign, not a flower. She sat in the same place, drank the same coffee, and left in silence. It was the only space where I could still breathe with some truth. The rest of his life, meetings, lunches, the wedding, was a soulless performance. He could no longer remember the last time he had had a real conversation with his wife. He no longer cared about the opinion of the partners, the agenda of the newspapers, the flashes of the photographers. Everything had become blurred since the day Marlene left without knocking. At home, he avoided the bedroom. He preferred to sleep on the couch where the silence didn't seem so heavy. He went over his memories like someone watching a silent movie, trying to pinpoint the exact second he lost what he never dared to call love. Sometimes he dreamed about her. He dreamed of trays, of flowers, of eyes that said what lips never said. He woke up before the end, always before, because his mind knew this story wouldn't have a happy ending, not the way he expected. At the cafe, Marlene maintained the same delicacy. Always. Attentive, always present, but with visible limits. Her relationship with the man with the light beard seemed discreet but solid. Sometimes he would enter the room and place his hand on her back naturally, as if he were part of the place. Nathan watched everything with a strange mixture of pain and respect. He didn't get up, he didn't look away. He just accepted it. He knew she deserved this. She deserved someone who would see her with courage, who wouldn't hide, who wouldn't leave her alone. On the altar of her own feelings. One cold morning, Nathan arrived at the cafe and found a new employee at the counter. A young, nervous woman who spilled coffee as she poured it. When he asked for Marlene, he heard, "She's off. Today is her birthday." She smiled, a sad, slow smile. He remembered that he had never known her birthday. They had spent months sharing silences, and he didn't even know the basics. And now he knew. Too late. On the way out, He bought a small white rose from a flower stand on the corner. He walked to the park 2 streets away. He sat on a bench and stayed there for hours. He thought about her, but not like before. He thought about her as if he were thinking about someone who had gone and left only their scent, a sweet but unreachable memory. He took a piece of napkin and wrote a few words. "If today is lighter, it's because you still breathe in it." He folded the paper, tied it to the rose, and left it all on the bench. Not as a request, but as a simple gesture from someone who finally understood that true love doesn't beg. It just waits to be seen, and when it isn't, it leaves. That night, when he returned home, Nathan went upstairs to the room he had been avoiding. He opened the windows and turned on the lights. He took the old cup hidden on the highest shelf and placed it on the tray. Next to it was a flower, and there, even without it, he poured himself a hot coffee, as if to say to himself, "Now I am the one who will serve." You memory. Months later, on a cloudy Saturday morning, Nathan received an unusual letter, a beige envelope with no return address, with his handwriting written in the center. He found it strange. He opened it carefully. Inside was a single folded piece of paper. He recognized it immediately. It was the note he had left on that park bench. "If today is lighter, it's because you still breathe in it." Next to it, a small card with a handwritten message. "Thank you for leaving this." It didn't have to be more than that. No signature, no address. But he knew. It was her. The flower had been picked. The gesture had been seen. And once again, she had responded in her own time. No scene, no exposition. Just what was necessary. It was at that moment that something inside him settled. It didn't heal. It didn't erase. But it settled. It was as if the universe had closed a cycle with the hands of the very woman he had let slip away. Not with a scream, not with a return, but with a symbolic gesture that said, "I saw, I understood, but I don't need this anymore." From that day on, Nathan stopped going to the cafe, not out of anger, not out of pain, but out of respect. He knew that his presence no longer belonged in that landscape. He was like an old painting on a new wall. Marlene had moved on, and he needed to learn to do the same. He sold the house where it all began, the white mansion with huge windows and stairs that echoed loneliness. He donated furniture, kept a few mementos, and left behind the room where he woke up so many times, believing that he could be loved, without the courage to love back. He moved to a small apartment near a quiet street, where he could make his own coffee and grow his own flowers. He no longer spoke of his ex-wife. The marriage, now ended by mutual silence, was just another consequence of a life he had lived for convenience. He began to write. Short sentences, loose thoughts, little texts that he left in old notebooks. Sometimes he wrote letters that he never sent, all of them to her, as a way of talking to what he had never lived. Years later, on a spring afternoon, Nathan was walking through a street festival. He passed craft stalls, live music, children running around with cotton candy. And then he saw a small stand called Flowers That Talk. Curious, he approached. It was a simple stand with delicate arrangements and cards attached to each flower, short phrases, poetic messages. He recognized the handwriting on one of them. It was unmistakable. Beneath a lavender flower it read, "Every morning deserves a second chance." His heart raced, but he didn't look for her. He knew that if she was there, it was because she had continued writing what she felt, for the world, no longer for him. He bought the flower. He took it home. He placed it on the tray he never used again. He poured himself some coffee, and there, in the silence of his new home, he understood. Karma does not always come as a punishment. Sometimes, it comes as a long lesson, and when it finally arrives, it does not hurt. It teaches. He had not lost Marlene. He just had not known how to see her when he could still touch her with his heart. On the wall of the living room, he hung the dried lavender flower next to the note that came back in the mail. And every morning when he woke up, he would make his own coffee, without rushing, without fresh flowers, but with memory. Because sometimes what remains is not the pain of having lost. It is the wisdom of having had meaning, and that no one can take away. Months later, on a cloudy Saturday morning, Nathan received an unusual letter. A beige envelope with no return address, with his handwriting written in the center. He found it strange. He opened it carefully. Inside was a single folded piece of paper. He recognized it immediately. It was the note he had left on that park bench. If today is lighter, it's because you still breathe in it. Next to it, a small card with a handwritten message. Thank you for leaving this. It didn't have to be more than that. No signature, no address. But he knew it was her. The flower had been picked, the gesture had been seen, and once again she had responded in her own time. No scene, no exposition, just what was necessary. It was at that moment that something inside him settled. It didn't heal, it didn't erase, but it settled. It was as if the universe had closed a cycle with the hands of the very woman he had let slip away. Not with a scream, not with a return, but with a symbolic gesture that said, I saw, I understood, but I don't need this anymore. From that day on, Nathan stopped going to the cafe, not out of anger, not out of pain, but out of respect. He knew that his presence no longer belonged in that landscape. He was like an old painting on a new wall. Marlene had moved on, and he needed to learn to do the same. He sold the house where it all began, the white mansion with huge windows and stairs that echoed loneliness. He donated furniture, kept a few mementos, and left behind the room where he woke up so many times believing that he could be loved without the courage to love back. He moved to a small apartment near a quiet street where he could make his own coffee and grow his own flowers. He no longer spoke of his ex-wife. The marriage, now ended by mutual silence, was just another consequence of a life he had lived for convenience. He began to write, short sentences, loose thoughts, little texts that he left in old notebooks. Sometimes he wrote letters that he never sent, all of them to her, as a way of talking to what he had never lived. Years later, on a spring afternoon, Nathan was walking through a street festival. He passed craft stalls, live music, children running around with cotton candy, and then he saw a small stand called Flowers That Talk. Curious, he approached. It was a simple stand, with delicate arrangements and cards attached to each flower. Short phrases, poetic messages. He recognized the handwriting on one of them. It was unmistakable. Beneath a lavender flower, it read, "Every morning deserves a second chance." His heart raced, but he didn't look for her. He knew that if she was there, it was because she had continued writing what she felt, for the world, no longer for him. He bought the flower. He took it home. He placed it on the tray he never used again. He poured himself some coffee, and there, in the silence of his new home, he understood. Karma does not always come as a punishment. Sometimes it comes as a long lesson, and when it finally arrives, it does not hurt, it teaches. He had not lost Marlene. He just had not known how to see her when he could still touch her with his heart. On the wall of the living room, he hung the dried lavender flower next to the note that came back in the mail. And every morning when he woke up, he would make his own coffee, without rushing, without fresh flowers, but with memory. Because sometimes what remains is not the pain of having lost, it is the wisdom of having had meaning. And that no one can take away. If this story spoke to your heart, leave your like now. If you also believe that silent love leaves eternal marks, write in the comments. True love doesn't scream, it just stays. Subscribe on the channel so you don't miss the next stories that touch where words can't reach. And now, watch the video that is appearing on your screen. He carries another truth that you may need to hear today.